Someplace grandfather did or his father did.
Many of these paper sons came in through a desolate place in San Francisco Bay, which opened in 1910. It was named Angel Island, sometimes called the Ellis Island of the West. Here, over the following 30 years, 175,000 Chinese would be held, interviewed, and eventually processed for entry or deportation. For the more than 20 million European immigrants who entered through New York's Ellis Island, the process was relatively quick. A cursory medical examination followed by a brief 29-question interview. At Angel Island, however, immigrants were often held for months and subjected to the repeated grilling of hostile inspectors who asked as many as 1,000 questions while trying to catch those with false identification. A wrong answer to any one of them could result in instant deportation. The sex-segregated dormitories were crowded, and food was abysmal. The terrible conditions sparked riots severe enough to require armed troops.
There's an incredible power to places like Angel Island in evoking the past. And I think that for many Chinese visitors who go, there's a very strong sense of the incarceration and the bitterness. But even for the non-Chinese visitor, in particular, walking through those hallways, seeing the poems and the bitter statements and the sadness that's carved on the walls, you can't help but come away with a sense of what it must have been like.
Angel Island is a legacy for all Americans. It's not just a Chinese-American legacy. I think it's something that reflects in our past that because it's unpleasant, we try to bury. This belongs in the annals of American history, not as an appendix. And it's not an aberration. It goes a long ways to tell us who we are, who we as Americans are.
Despite the creative ways they were able to circumvent the Exclusion Act, places like Angel Island ensured that Chinese immigration into America was slowed to a trickle. Yet even before the Exclusion Act was passed, the Chinese still faced enormous challenges in their efforts to survive and prosper. One of those efforts helped transform California's Central Valley into the breadbasket of the nation. Of all the achievements of the Chinese in North America, one of the greatest and least appreciated is the creation of the farming lands of the Sacramento River Delta. Once unproductive swamps, these 180,000 acres of reclaimed fields are an important part of California's multi-billion-dollar agricultural industry, which is famous for being not only the largest in the country, but one of the largest on the globe. What isn't generally known, however, is that this land was created by the labors of Chinese workers, using techniques that had been tried and perfected in China over a period of at least 2,000 years. The process began in the early 1870s.
Once the Transcontinental Railroad is completed, California, which has always been a garden of wonderful fruits and grains and wines, now is linked to the East Coast, and the railroad inspires an explosion in California's agricultural industry. The Chinese, who had just completed working on the Transcontinental Railroad, now turned their hand as laborers to planting the vineyards in the Napa Valley and cutting huge caves into the hillsides for the storage and for the fermentation of wine. They're also working in the Central Valley, draining the delta, constructing the dikes and the intricate systems of waterways that will irrigate the fields that will see the Central Valley become the breadbasket of the world in the 1870s and the 1880s.
During this process, the Chinese settled in small Chinatowns in communities all over Central California. The Exclusion Act had not yet been created, and Chinese workers poured into the area, both on their own and as labor gangs recruited by white landowners. However, when the Chinatown in the predominantly Caucasian city of Walnut Grove burned down in 1915, they went one step further, building an entirely separate and autonomous Chinese community, the town of Locke, California. The site was originally part of an orchard owned by a local Caucasian family named the Locks.
1915, my father, he took maybe a dozen of the Chinese merchants, the Zhongshan people, up to the orchard, half a mile up north, and start building that town, shaking hands with agreement with the Locke.
This was accomplished despite the fact that it was against the law for the Chinese to actually own the land their houses were built on. Though they were allowed to own the structures themselves, they had to rent the land on which they stood from the Locke family. It was the first town built by Chinese entirely with Chinese money. By the time Ping Li was a young boy during the mid-1920s, Locke had grown from its humble beginnings to become a thriving community.
Locke was a pretty busy little town. We have maybe 30 or 40 families, 30 or 40 stores, and some of the stores, the upstairs the residents live, and downstairs and you run a store. It could be a hardware store, like my father had 7 of them, all in town. It was a busy place, especially on weekends when Locke could have 400 or 500 people. These are the farmhands that come up here from the sharecroppers' ranches, and they were sitting outside. Each storefront would have a bench. On a Sunday, there was roast pig, roast duck, all the things that today you see in San Francisco, Chinatown on a smaller scale.
One of the businesses owned by Ping Li's father was a small gambling hall. Contrary to stereotype, it was hardly a den of iniquity. Like many other Chinese businesses, it served an important social function, particularly because the towns of the Central Valley were too small to have separate spaces for branches of the district associations.
My father's so-called gambling house even had like a post office in the back. That's only one of the things they do. Then they used to have Chinese instruments like banjos and things like that. And a lot of those guys, they get together, and 4 or 5 of them, they would play and they would sing, and they do a lot of things there. And there's always tea for them to drink. So that's why those places sometimes serve as a social hall.
Ping Li's father also practiced the ancient Chinese tradition of herbal medicine. Still used today, it employs time-proven natural remedies to treat a wide variety of ailments. Another legacy of their homeland, herb stores and doctors could be found almost every place the Chinese settled. One of these stores still stands today in Fiddletown, California. It was founded during the 1850s by Dr. Herbert Yi's great-grandfather, Nifong Chong, who, like Ping Li's, owned several successful businesses.
He was a merchant prince. He was, of course, in those days, established this herb store, and he was everything, meaning he was the postmaster for the Chinese. He would send mail with money and collect mail. He would have his herb store to treat the miners for their ailment. He also had a grocery store, and you can always find a hot meal on a weekend when you come from the gold field, and they would sit around the potbelly stove and have some hot food with them. He was even a cobbler, so he did just about everything, up in that little town.
Amazingly, Nifong Chong's herb store is in exactly the same condition as it was in the early 1900s, when its last owner locked it up, turned it over to his handyman, and returned to China.
He made sure that nothing was taken out of it or nothing was brought in. So everything is in its original form. So it's one of the very few buildings that has survived those many years, that has kept all of the content intact.
Though towns like Fiddletown and Locke were small and relatively isolated, collectively, they had an enormous impact on China itself. One of the most notable examples was in the early 20th century, when thousands of Chinese Americans rallied to support the budding Chinese nationalist revolutionary movement, led by Dr. Sun Yat-sen. The remnants of that enthusiasm can be seen today adorning Chinese community halls in the Delta and throughout America.
Sun Yat-sen was, of course, he's the George Washington of China. Of course, he had a lot of followers, and my father, being over here, was a follower of Dr. Sun, and a lot of these people, these ranch hands, most of these people were followers of Dr. Sun.
The schoolhouse that stands in Locke today was originally built by Ping Li's father as a small lecture hall for followers of Dr. Sen, who often toured the area raising money for his cause. It was later used to house the local Chinese school, where Chinese parents sent their American-born children to learn the language, customs, and tradition of their ancestral homeland. One of the students here was Ping Li's son, Darwin, who, like all the other Chinese children, was also attending traditional U.S. public school.
We had to go to Chinese school 5 days a week, and I believe it started at 5 o'clock and it went to 7. The parents would put the kids in there trying to learn the Chinese language and so forth and so on. As for me, the schoolmaster would ring the bell. It would take me quite a long time to get back into class. Sometimes I had to come and get me.
Education is something that is extremely important to almost all Chinese Americans, who see it as one of the best ways they have to overcome the many barriers that block their advancement.
If I said one thing was for the future of the Chinese people that either came here as immigrants, the ones that came over and worked on the railroads, the ones that came over and worked as waiters or worked in restaurants and whatever, I would say that the one overwhelming concept that everybody would probably agree on is that, you have to have a good education to survive. And every Chinese family I know, young, old, poor, rich, the main emphasis is on the children to get a good education and try to use that education to better themselves.
My grandfather was so committed to education that my father went to college, but he had all sisters, and all 7 of them got college degrees in an era when it was very difficult for a woman to be college educated, to be a Chinese woman and be college educated. It was a pretty phenomenal achievement for them and for my grandfather.
Even though Ping Li's father had no formal schooling himself, he insisted that his son go to college.
My father strongly believed in education. So I spent 2.5 years in junior college to make up for all the things. Then I went into Berkeley as a junior, and I graduated in business administration and political science.
Darwin also earned a college degree. After graduating, he could have left the area and gone off on his own. But like his father before him and Frank Kwan at China Camp, he decided to stay, joining his father in the family grocery business in nearby Walnut Grove.
As I was growing up, I was working in the store, helping my dad, and he says, well, this is the one person that would like to do this. He doesn't like to study, but I think he can be a businessman. So he kind of directed me toward that, and it was even easier than I ever dreamed of because it was what I've been doing all my life. My father is still here at 82 years old. I do the physical thing. He does the mental thing, the business outlook thing, which is the best part because he knows when, what, and how of everything.
Like the Kwans at China Camp, the history of the Khans and Lees in Locke, California exemplifies the deep commitment of Chinese Americans to their families, communities, and rich cultural heritage. Stories like this would be mirrored farther east in another community, one that would eventually grow to become the second largest Chinatown in the United States. On the main artery of New York City's Chinatown at 32 Mott Street stands a building that symbolizes the striking similarities between the Chinese no matter where they settle in North America. It's not a monument, or even a district association. It's a store, one that was founded by Paul Lee's grandfather, Lee Locke, in the late 1800s. But like the stores in Locke and Fiddletown, it served many other purposes as well, including a mail drop for the Chinese immigrants who began coming in through Ellis Island as paper sons during the late 19th century.
It's my understanding that at Ellis Island, there may be 30, 40, 50,000 people showing their home address as 32 Mott Street, when they couldn't all possibly live in the building at the same time. So what they were doing was getting their mail sent there and then spreading out all over the Northeast, Boston, Philadelphia, Washington, then coming back and picking up their mail.
Like the stores in Locke and Fiddletown, 32 Mott Street also served as an herb shop. It was even an unofficial bank, since, at the time, Chinese were not allowed to have bank accounts.
We kind of have gone full circle. Initially, we served a lot of functions, more than just selling products. Now we are a bill payment center for the community, for people paying their phone bills. So now a lot more of the local trade is coming in. And it sounds like a minimal thing, but it's actually very good for us, and we like it a lot. It brings a lot of our old neighbors back into the store.
Businesses like 32 Mott Street were part of the nucleus of what would become America's second largest Chinatown. However, the beginnings of this community were modest. In 1870, when the Chinese population of San Francisco was approximately 12,000, there were fewer than 50 Chinese in New York City. But by the end of the 19th century, New York's Chinatown had grown to almost 7,000. Most of its newcomers were Chinese fleeing the violence and discrimination on the West Coast. Like the Chinese everywhere, they brought their social institutions with them. Among the first to be established were the district and family associations. Many of these, including Irwin Liu's Four Brotherhood Association, are still important in today's Chinatown.
It's a place today where people can go in the afternoon, have a cup of tea, watch TV, play some card games, have dinner there. Usually the family association will subsidize the dinner, and the members that go there to eat at night will chip in $1 or $2 for a very nice, healthy dinner, and then spend some time together and go home.
However, some aspects of the associations were not so constructive. Among the most notorious conflicts to rip across Chinatown were the bloody gang wars between the two main business associations, the Hip Sing Tong and the On Leong Tong, that raged between 1896 and 1925.
And these are organizations which had for its main purpose commercial interests, but the commercial interests became territorial. Hip Sing said, Pell Street and Dorr Street are my territory, I'll take care of the businesses here. On Leong says, Mott Street's my territory, we'll take care of the businesses here. But the businesses sometimes were not strictly legitimate businesses, some became gambling establishments and so forth. So in the territorial fights, they were some Tong wars.
Pell Street and Mott Street is one area that was sort of the dividing line. Pell and Doyer was a more famous area, and Doyer Street itself was specifically called the Bloody Elbow because there were so many battles fought on that little particular street. And it's a tiny little street.
In 1925, a truce between the warring Tongs finally brought peace. But since the street fights, violence and steady stream of murders had been reported in lurid detail in the white press, America's worst impressions of the Chinese seemed confirmed. This attitude began to change, however, in the 1930s. A large factor was the Japanese invasion of China in 1931. As reports of Japan's brutal conquest filled newspapers and newsreels, sympathy for the Chinese grew. When the United States declared war on Japan in 1941, Chinese Americans flocked to enlist, even though half were not and by law could not be citizens. 13,000 Chinese men served in America's armies and air corps. It was the highest percentage of men in uniform of any single ethnic group. 17% of the entire Chinese American population.
My grandmother, Rose Ah Tai, had 6 sons who were in the service during World War II. My father flew 35 missions over France and Germany, and he earned the United States Air Medal with oak clusters and the Distinguished Flying Cross.
As a result of sacrifices like these, the United States Congress finally repealed the Chinese exclusion laws in 1943. Although the repeal only allowed for 105 new immigrants from China per year, it made nearly half the 40,000 foreign-born Chinese living in America eligible for citizenship. After the war, the changing atmosphere helped the Chinese begin to make new inroads into American society. And for the first time, women started to become part of mainstream Chinatown.
After World War II, first group of war brides, and then a relaxation of wives of U.S. citizens. And that's when we started to have women in this community. And the women made a fundamental change in what happened to the community. Number one, they were demanding of services and food and things that were not available at that time. Number two, many became available for the labor market, and now we have a very extensive garment industry here.
Besides these changes, the influx of women allowed for the increasing formation of strong nuclear family units in Chinatown. These complemented and strengthened the extended family relationships that had previously been supported by the family associations. The developing environment of post-war Chinatown also created better opportunities for immigrants from China. One of these was Irwin Liu's father, Mr. C.P. Liu, who arrived in 1947.
He wound up as a waiter. Then he saw all the restaurants needed this type of vegetable called the bean sprout, which was basically a mung bean seed. And he decided that he would grow these in his home at first, you know, in the sink or the bathtub or in whatever he had. Then eventually he left being a waiter and opened up his own hydroponic farm in the basement of a building on Division Street. At the top of the market, he was probably growing about 4 to 6 tons a day out of there.
But business wasn't the only way for the Chinese to become successful. In post-World War II America, more traditional careers that had previously been closed to the Chinese also began to open up. In New York, one of these was in the New York City Police Department.
Yes, B. Chief Fong here.
Hi, Chief.
Good. What's going on at the borough?
Today, Dewey Fong is its first Chinese-American deputy chief.
Although my grandfather and my father were in the laundry business during their time, and they made a career of it until they retired, I basically did not have a desire to go into the traditional role for the Chinese in America. When I first joined the police department in November of '79, there was only maybe a dozen or so Asian American police officers in all the agencies combined in the greater New York area. That number has now graduated to over 400 members.
One of them is Thomas Chan, who in 1993 became the first Chinese-American commander of the 5th Precinct, which encompasses New York's Chinatown. People like Thomas Chan and Dewey Fong have not forgotten their roots.
I'm ABC, American-born Chinese, and I was born in New York City here, born and raised. Certainly Chinatown is ingrained in myself. The food, the customs, it feels like home to me. I find myself frequenting and coming back to Chinatown because that's where I feel very comfortable among other Chinese.
I always had an appreciation of the culture as well as the arts from the Chinese community. So I started to play traditional classical Cantonese music.
Dewey also plays with a group of highly skilled professional composers and musicians called Music from China. Music, combined with storytelling and movement, is also an important theatrical form that not only entertains, but preserves the lore and classical tales of China's past, as reflected in the popular shadow puppet shows performed in villages throughout China. Chinese opera presents a much more extravagant and sophisticated form of these elements.
Opera is not just singing or music. I mean, it really carries with it history, carries with it tradition, and it really provides an insight into the Chinese philosophy that's been prevalent for so many thousands of years.
One of the opera troupes in New York City's Chinatown includes members of the local senior center.
By the way, it's so popular here that people who don't qualify as senior citizens also come in here to rehearse with the group. They go out and they make visits to the prisons in the area and play Chinese music to prisoners in the New York City correction system. They have acquired a taste in music that I have not yet personally acquired for this Cantonese opera.
Other ancient customs practiced by the people of Chinatown are various forms of dance and disciplined exercise, including Tai Chi. These graceful movements, which are performed by many people in China today,